Hi. So today's video is going to be about cancer. The video that we watched before this was about the cell cycle. And so cancer is when the cell cycle is not working properly. and so we're going to title our notes Cancer. And before I get into the details about what cancer is, I'd like to say that a normal cell will undergo the cell cycle about 40 to 60 times in its life. Okay, so a normal cell will undergo the cell cycle about 40 to 60 times in its life. Okay, and what this means is um, mitosis and meiosis. Okay, so that's what's included in the cell cycle. Um, so cancer. Cancer is when the cell cycle doesn't work properly and a cell starts to undergo the cell cycle and it's out of control. Okay, and starts to replicate out of control. Okay, so it just continues to replicate without stopping. I want to say that about 1 million people develop cancer in the US every year. So in the US, about 1 million people develop cancer per year. And about 10,000 people per week in the US die from cancer. So in the US again, 10,000 people will die of cancer. So having cancer is very common, and it is a fatal disorder. And so probably you know somebody who has had cancer. I want to point out that there are over 100 different types of cancer. Over 100 different types of cancer. And each type of cancer is categorized based on where the cancer starts. Okay, so each cancer type is based on where the cancer started. And cancer starts in one cell. So one cell gets messed up, and then that one cell starts to replicate out of control, and then that's what cancer is. Okay, so cancer starts in one cell. Okay, so I want to point out how this happens. Okay, so that's one section. I want to point out how this happens. So the cell cycle, which we talked about in the last video, is where it goes through interphase and then it goes through the replication, which is mitosis. And the cell cycle is regulated, which means that it's turned on and turned off by 7 different proteins. And these 7 different proteins are coded in the DNA, which means there are 7 different genes, 7 different genes that code for proteins. Okay, and these proteins are enzymes that regulate the cell cycle. And when I say regulate, that means turning it on and turning it off. So turning it on and off. Okay, so there's these 7 proteins in your cells that will turn on the cell cycle when it needs to turn on and turn off the cell cycle when it needs to be turned off. And so these 7 genes are coded in the DNA. And so every time your cell replicates, it is replicating all the DNA and mutations happen. Okay, and it's natural for mutations to happen. Okay, so I'm going to write this down. When the cell replicates, all the DNA is copied. Okay, so every single nucleotide is being copied, and there are always a few mutations. And there are always a few mutations. And a mutation is a change in the nucleotide in the DNA. So a mutation is a change in a nucleotide in the DNA. Okay, so you have a cell and it replicates and it has some mutations in the new cell. And it keeps those mutations because when that cell replicates, it has those same mutations and then it adds a few more. And then now that cell has the mutations from 2 cells ago and this one, and then it replicates and it adds a few more. So the mutations accumulate every time the cell undergoes the cell cycle. So I'm going to say mutations in the DNA accumulate every time the cell replicates. Okay, and if you think about it, you know, you live to be 80 years old, your cells have been replicating for 80 years. That's a lot of replications, which equals a lot of mutations. And if mutations happen in those 7 genes that control the cell cycle, then cancer happens. Okay, so I'm going to say cancer happens when mutations occur in all 7 genes that control the cell cycle. Okay, and so if a mutation occurs in one of those 7 genes, it's fine. Okay, but then maybe the next time it replicates, now it's in 2. And let's say the next time it replicates like 10 more times, now it's in 3. And then it replicates like 10 more times, now it's in 4. So over time, your chances of getting cancer are higher and higher because you have been replicating cells your whole life and building up the mutations. And as you know, getting cancer is a random thing. It is just random that those mutations happen to land in one of those 7 genes and then in all 7. So it's just very, very unlucky, but it has nothing to do with like the type of person you are or how you look or how you live. I mean, there are some things you can do to help, but it is a random, actually a natural thing that happens, unfortunately. Okay, so I want to say that um, so these mutations. Okay, I want to talk about the mutations actually. So I don't want to lie. So these mutations that I'm talking about, it's called a mutation rate. A mutation rate and a natural mutation rate, which means that every time your cell replicates, mutations occur, and it is 1 in every 1 million nucleotides. So the mutation rate in a normal replication is equal to one nucleotide in every 1 million nucleotides. Okay, so every 1 in 1 million is going to get mutated, and that's natural, and that just happens. And so what that means for humans is that we have about 3 billion nucleotides in our DNA. So what that means is every time your cell replicates, you get 3,000 mutations every time. And so remember, we have 3 billion nucleotides, so that's a lot. And 3,000 is just a tiny, tiny fraction, but you get 3,000 mutations every time your cells replicate. And then there's this other thing where if you are exposed to what is called a mutagen, okay, and a mutagen is also known as a carcinogen. And so a mutagen is something that causes more mutation than the normal rate, okay? So the mutation rate with a mutagen, it increases the amount of mutations that happen. And it is going to go as much as 1 in 1,000 nucleotides. So 1 nucleotide in every 1,000. That's a lot of mutations. Okay? Okay, so What I want to talk about next are these mutagens. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of some mutagens. And you've heard of these before, there's a lot in society that is known about what can cause cancer. And what that means is that these things cause mutations in your DNA, which give you a higher probability of getting cancer. These things don't actually cause the cancer, but they do cause the mutations, which can lead to the cancer. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. Okay, two examples. Examples of mutagens. The first example is called benzopyrene. And benzopyrene is a chemical that is found in smoke. Chemical found in smoke. And it's in any type of smoke. So cigarette smoke, campfire smoke, marijuana smoke, any kind of smoke. And this chemical, what it does is it gets inside your DNA. It like embeds itself in the DNA. This is called an intercalating agent. And so because it gets inside the DNA double helix, when the cell is replicating, that section that has the benzopyrene stuck in there can't replicate. So then you end up with mutations. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture of benzopyrene wedged inside the DNA helix. Okay, let's see here, right here, benzopyrene. Okay, and so here's a picture of the DNA helix. And so these orange bars are the backbone of the DNA, so like the sides of the ladder. And then right here is the benzopyrene. So I'm going to circle it in red. And what it does is it gets wedged inside. And like I said, when the DNA goes to get replicated in that section, mutations are going to happen because there's something like messing up the whole mechanism of replicating the DNA. Okay, so that's the first mutagen. The second mutagen is UV light. Okay, and we've all heard about UV light being dangerous. Everybody knows you need to wear sunscreen when you go outside, and that's because UV light causes mutations in your DNA. What it does is it causes what's called a thymine dimer. Thymine dimer. And what a thymine dimer is when you have a DNA strand. I'm going to write a DNA strand like this. So here's one side. I'm going to draw the other side in a different color. Okay, and so here's one side of the DNA, and then this is the complementary side. Okay, and so I'm going to say that there is an A here, C here. So on this side, it's going to be T, T, G. Okay, and then let's say some UV light. Some UV light hits the DNA. And what happens is this thymine dimer occurs where these two neighbor T's get stuck to each other. It's this really weird thing. But so this side is now going to have these A's just on their own without a partner. And the C is still going to be bound. And then we have these two T's are going to bind to each other. Okay, so this G is still going to be here. But this T is going to bind to this T. And so when that happens, the double helix kind of puckers and it has this weird odd shape. And so when the DNA goes to get replicated, because of that puckering, the DNA replication gets messed up and then you get a mutation. Okay, so I think I might have a picture of that. Yes, here's a thymine dimer. Okay, so this is a picture from the book, and here is a DNA helix. Okay, so everything's fine. UV hits it, and now these two yellow ones, which are the thymines, are now bonded to each other. And so now there's this little like puckering that happens. And so DNA replication can't happen in a normal way. And that leads to mutations. Okay, so the last thing that I want to go over is that when a cell becomes a cancer cell, there are these very characteristic traits that a cancer cell has. So I'm going to say there are 5 characteristics of a cancer cell, okay? And so all cancer cells have these 5 characteristics, and I'm going to explain them while comparing them to a normal cell. Okay, so the first thing that a cancer cell has is they do not exhibit contact inhibition. So do not exhibit contact inhibition. Okay, and let me explain what contact inhibition is. So a normal cell, this is what I'm gonna draw normal cells here. Hang on, let me get rid of the lines. Okay, so this is a normal cell, and let's say this is like a piece of skin, and so all the cells are really close together. Okay, and in your skin, your cells are watertight, close together. Okay, and so I'm gonna say this is normal. And normal cells do exhibit contact inhibition. So normal cells do show contact inhibition. And what contact inhibition means is that a cell will not replicate if it is touching another cell. So contact means touching. And so see the cell here in the middle, it's touching all these other cells. So this cell in the middle is not going to replicate because it is touching others. That's called contact inhibition. And that's what prevents cells from replicating normally. If they're touching a neighbor cell, there needs no need for replication. But let's say, for example, you get injured and some cells are missing. And so this space right here is what triggers a cell to undergo cell replication. And so there's no contact happening. So now this cell is free to replicate into a new cell. Okay, so a new cell gets replicated. Okay, with cancer, I'm going to say, oops, let me see here. I'm going to say that this middle cell turns into a cancer cell. Okay, which means all 7 of those genes got mutated. The cell cycle is now out of control. And so I'm going to make the cancer cell pink. And so this cancer cell just turned into a cancer cell. And now it doesn't care that it's touching a bunch of other cells. It just starts replicating out of control. So it is just going, going, going. And it's going to make lots of cells right there in that place, which is what makes this big tumor. And so when you have this growth of tissue, that is what cancer is. Okay, so the first characteristic of a cancer cell is they do not do contact inhibition. The second characteristic is they are not in an organized layer. So these cells are not in an organized layer. Okay, and so with skin cells, for example, they're all very tight, organized, multiple layers in a very like orderly fashion. Cancer cells don't do that. They are just like willy-nilly make a big tumor. They don't care about organization. Okay. Okay, the third thing that a cancer cell does is, what's the third thing? Oh, it recruits blood vessels to it. Okay, so cancer cells recruit blood vessels. Okay, this is a special word. It is called angiogenesis. And it does this because cancer cells need more nutrients than normal because it's this growing tumor. And so it's going to recruit blood vessels to come to it to feed it. So isn't that crazy? That's called angiogenesis. Okay, the fourth thing that happens is that cancer cells are able to move from one location to another location. Normal cells never do that. Once a cell is like, it's got its job, for example, a skin cell, it is never going to go anywhere else. Once it's there, it's going to stay there forever. Or like you have a heart cell, it stays a heart cell forever. It never goes anywhere else. You have a brain cell, the brain cell never moves somewhere else. But cancer cells do move. That is called metastasis. So cancer cells can do metastasis, which means it can move to other parts of the body. Okay. And we've heard this. We've heard that cancer can spread to other parts of the body, and cancer is able to do that. Normal cells do not do that. Okay, and the last thing that cancer cells have is that normal cells, when there are lots of mutations in DNA, like more than normal, the cell will undergo what's called apoptosis. Apoptosis is cell suicide. So a cell will kill itself if there are too many DNA mutations in it, and that's normal. Like, for example, in the cell cycle, at G2 is a checkpoint to check DNA mutations. If there's too many, that cell will die. Cancer cells do not do apoptosis. Cancer cells do not do apoptosis.